Hi, this is Dr. Travanchek. I'm going to do a series of PowerPoints, which I'm going to post on YouTube. This particular one is focused on general philosophy and showing budgies. And so the philosophy of showing birds is like any other philosophy. You have to sort of decide what part of the competitive arena you are interested in occupying. And in American football, we have a saying that indicates eagerness to compete even on unequal conditions. And that sort of mantra or um, uh, saying is anywhere, anyone, anywhere, anytime. So if you love competition, then doing your best actually is the only test. Always aiming to be best at the show instead of best in show. And I think you're going to find if you take that general philosophy, you're going to be happy whether you win anything or not. On a personal level, something inside me personally loves competition, and budgies are a competitive hobby, taking it to the highest level because it's obviously these are exhibition budgies. Um, so like many of you, I like to win, but I certainly don't need to win to enjoy my birds, to enjoy the birds and everybody else's birds. I just don't need to win. A lot of people sort of, I don't see a lot of people who are that way, but um, I just, this is part of what I want to talk to a little bit about today. So I've been competing with budgies all my life, and I'm going to show as many birds as I can and hope my competition does the same. There's no use beating an inferior group of birds. You want to, as the sort of first slide said, you want to compete against the best. And if you want to be the best, and in order to be the best, you have to beat the best. So as a child and young adult, my family, my father in particular, did not allow me to travel to shows or be able to see my birds being judged. So, because of that time, my parents were, quite frankly, against my interest in birds. So I became used to not to seeing my birds being judged and only to learn about the results of the show, either by phone, occasionally by reading them in a newspaper, or somebody would send me a letter, or I would call them. So I was used, unlike most American fanciers, not seeing my birds judged, and so I didn't ever had the habit of second guessing judges during the competition. Many years later, when I was in private practice and took up my birds again, I had some uh, kids that helped me take care of the birds. And they actually showed the birds. I seldom, if ever, went to shows, and I just stayed in my office, and they would call and tell me how the birds did and what the general quality of the birds were, and and sort of that. So on my time, being tied to winning is just not something that I thought was useful. I understand that luck, and you need to understand that luck uh, does not play a small part in this. However, if you want your bird to do your birds justice, preparation and training are absolutely vital. So if you want to show a wide range of budgies, so that gives your aviary, your stud, the best chance of winning. Um, it's said that the great Harry Bryant used to show every type of bird, every type of feather, every type of color to maximize his chance of winning. And he used to show fantastic. He eventually used to show fantastic recessive pieds, just to show the depth of his stud and the range of his skill. And so that's what that was something that influenced me as a teenager. I believe that, and I believe it to this day. And dogs and other livestock, the ownership of the animal is not an issue. So if you own a dog, you show the dog under your name, uh, and, and no matter who bred it, somebody else breeds the dog that you are showing. It's not the dog's fault, and the only the quality of the dog is going to be or should be considered. In the 1950s, birds from the UK made it to the show bench in this country, and many won. However, in 1956, an American bird beat several British-banded birds at our Budgie convention and broke that spell. As a youngster, even as a youngster, I was able to beat some British-banded birds, and I can tell you that that was more than satisfying. I don't believe in limiting competition. I believe that anyone, anywhere, anytime, and you want your birds to compete against the best. And so I believe in totally open shows because I really like competition. That's pretty unusual, unfortunately, in this country, in America. What supports our passion of exhibition budgerigards and fancy, or is the fancy. Uh, so what I'm saying to you is the fancy, as I understand it and view it, is comprised of organizations and societies and associations which comprise professionals and hobbyists who are interested and dedicated in the sport, and I consider it a sport, competitive sport of showing purebred dogs, cats, fish, chickens, and of course budgerigars. The exhibition circus to me is the lifeblood of societies, which in turn is the backbone of the fancy. This is the fancy issues bans, creates rules, has these exhibitions, and also has general control of of rules inside the competition and the fancy. So, and that actually holds the whole thing together. So this is the part that each of us can and should and must support to ensure the survival and advancement of our wonderful and charismatic birds. Said another way, this is a competitive endeavor which can also be thought of as a sport, a judged competition, which is sort of what I had said before. What's special about our budgies is that we can show as many as we have show cages and room in our car or wagon or minivan. As I said earlier, exhibition budgies has nothing to do with winning or losing. Most budgies lose at some point. So that is a win-loss or zero-sum game that I think needs to be discouraged unless your only goal is to uh, be best in show. If your actual goal is just to show outstanding budgies and lots of them, you will actually never have a bad show. I remember Brian Biles, who was editor of Cajun Avery Birds, 1979, won Best at Show of Other Southern Counties with a rather stunning gray-green cocky. Brian specialized in light greens and gray greens and had the occasional blue uh, and uh, and obviously occasional gray, but most of the birds that he showed and bred in the aviary were light greens and gray greens. At any rate, he was surrounded by admiring fanciers trying to get birds from him, although people were always trying to get birds from him because of the way in which he bred birds, and I will discuss that later in a different topic about the importance of the way you raise your birds. But anyway, he was, as I said, a long time editor of Cajun Avery Birds, and he said to them, or he used to say, he said it in print, and he said it to them, that you're lucky if you win. And the longer I am at this, and it covers about 65 years or so, um, I believe Brian's right. The number and quality of your team has to do with letting all the fanciers in public see the depth of your stud. So that's one of the reasons that I like to show a lot of birds, and I'm not limited by some sort of group of birds that I'm trying to win best in show with. I'll show birds out of the sail flight, or I'm going to discuss that. I always believe that letting our fantastic works of art out of their little private prisons in our home and see the light of day and take a road trip to be enjoyed by everyone who took the time and money and effort to go to the show. So that's my general philosophy, is I'm showing to everybody who comes to the show, not necessarily to the judge, which I really it's important, but to me, everyone who comes to the show and sees the birds is really what I'm showing birds to. So as I said, I've been showing birds all my life. In the 1950s, as a teen and almost preteen, I would show birds in distant cities, and I would put the birds in a cardboard box, kind of like a shoebox, and take them on a bus to the show. I usually slept overnight on the bus, arrived the next day, uh, walked to my hotel because I didn't have enough money for the cab, which is usually the cheapest in the city. The bird shows were not in the cheapest hotels in the city, and eventually took a cab out to the show, where somebody would take me to the show, and I would rent show cages in advance or on the spot. I was limited only by the size of the box under my bus seat and the amount of money I had to rent show cages. However, I tried to show every bird that was in good feather, weight, and condition, and I always thought that it was a real tragedy to leave any bird home for any reason. So if the birds were in good physical condition and to make the trip, in all my times showing birds, I've showed hundreds of birds and hundreds of shows. I don't recall ever losing a bird during or after a show. Of course, many um, of the best birds in your aviary will be in breeding cages because you're breeding them. But that doesn't mean they're not going to the show. So if a bird had a cock had a few, let's say a baby or two that he was feeding out, or maybe not feeding out, but in the nest, I showed them anyway. They were in good condition. They seemed to want to go to the show, which I will discuss in a minute. So I've had several best in show cocks that had hens on eggs or were feeding babies at the time of the show, and they won. So show preparation to me begins the moment your babies come out of the nest box. To begin playing with them, I encourage you to play with your birds at the time they leave the nest. Allows them to be handled without alarm. They're not alarmed by the human hand, which is something that most people feel is a inborn um, hereditary trait. Human hands alarm most things, including birds. Anyway, it definitely adds to the steadiness of the perch. However, uh, on a slightly separate uh, issue, in terms of posture and deportment, that's only affected by breeding. So you can train your birds to be steady and to be relaxed in the show cage, but only breeding affects, to me, affects posture. That's something I'm afraid that postures in birds, that's something I've noticed that we may have lost some edge in that. So I've, for decades, believed that your birds need experience in show cages, particularly overnight. So they need to learn that the show cage um, is nothing to be afraid of, and they need to be comfortable in show cages. It's vital to getting them used to living in those cages for a few days. I never really put more than 2 birds in a cage, and only rarely more than one. So as the first time or two, they're in the cages overnight, show cages overnight, um, hanging on the side of the flights and just in the bird room in general. I've had cages, show cages hanging on my flights. And I'm not in the flights, but on the flights. And as birds seem to, I get time to put the birds in there, I would just put them in there and I wouldn't chase them around with a stick or anything like that. I would just put them in there with spray millet and seed and water. And sometimes I'd leave them overnight. Sometimes I'd leave them for a day or two if I didn't remember that they were in the cages. They had plenty of seed. They could have been there for a month. So all of my serious birds spent at least one day and one night in the show cages so that they would learn how to eat and drink. That to me is vital. And each one of us prepare our birds in our own way, but ham-tamed birds, I think, have a huge advantage. When I showed budgies in the 1980s, starting about 1980 or so, I always filled my show cages, every cage I had, and I would show an average of 30 birds or so. Um, and I tried to put birds in every division, just like Harry Bryan, to come at best in show from a lot of different angles. So I showed young birds and old birds, cocks and hens, and I just, if they were in condition and good health, off to the show they went. They had to be quality birds, but I just, and that's, I think, a reason that I feel you have to have a large, not necessarily large stud, but a stud with even quality so that your 100th bird can go to the show and represent you credibly. I have had a number of 10-month-old birds that have won best in show. And so, as you know, some birds are naturals and they are charismatic birds. The minute they leave the nest, you see this. And so the first opportunity they're in feather, off to the show they go. I also took birds from my resting flights and from my sail flights to the shows. These were all good birds, and I'm not saying great birds, but they were good birds. I wouldn't show a bad bird just on the idea that it's not fair to the bird. So anyway, these were all good birds, and to me, they were more than happy to take the trip. Why leave them at home if they're good birds? To me, you want everyone to see them. I have a friend, Julie Willis, who I admire a lot, and I think has a really good intellect in this country. And we talk not off and on. And I remember one time we were talking, and I said, "Well, how do you select your birds?" And so anyway, she said she walks in the flight, and she says, "Who wants to go to the show?" And quite frankly, that's what I did all my life. I walked into the flight cages. I said, looked around. I said, who wants to go to the show? And the ones that seemed to be the most vigorous and happy, enthusiastic, off to the show they went. Recently, I had a long conversation with Dr. Rennie Halen, who lives in Belgium. He has a very large stud, but he also has a larger show team, and which is something Rennie and I view, I think, the support of the fancy the same way. And he shows 24 birds at the club show each year. And I don't know how often he wins best in show, but I can tell you that the birds that he shows are absolutely stunning birds. Anyway, he also has 2 teams of birds. So on the occasion it arises, he splits his team. So he's showing 48 birds and sends teams to 2 different shows. So he believes what Harry Bryan believes, what I think all the breeders, even the lanes, going back, and they would show uh, given numbers of birds in their show team. So his experience is exactly like mine. You never know what bird's going to win. He and his partner pick out these birds, and they have a few reserve birds, which I really never had. I just showed everything that was in condition, had their spots, had their tails, off they go, right, proper body weight, and off they go for the ride. So he had used to have a few reserve birds, which they would just throw in birds that neither impressed neither one of them along for the ride. And one year, um, only a sort of add-on reserve bird won best in show. So that would be, I can tell you that many add-on and reserve birds, in my experience, has been that is the case, you know, when you're talking about the judge. But I'm not showing to the judges. I'm showing to everybody who comes to the show. And even if I'm not showing, I attend shows if I can. I've been going to the club show every year for the last 15 or 20 years that I could attend. And I just personally enjoy the energy of the show and all those people who share a passion that I have for these fantastic birds. Um, so anyway, so for decades, people who knew I was coming to the show, and I went to every show that I possibly could within, let's say, 500 or 1,000 miles. And they would call me and they'd ask me if I had birds for sale. And usually they were in the show. So, and frequently the sale birds, they would ask me which birds were for sale in the back up. Anyway, so they would ask me which birds were for sale, and I would tell them. And occasionally I would say, well, this particular bird is very close to my show team, so if it does well, I probably will not sell it today or maybe next week, but if you still like the bird, eventually when the bird's for sale, I will sell you the bird at whatever price we agreed to, even if it wins best in show. And I've had more than one time where the birds that were for sale actually won best in show. So when the internet got a hold of the fancy about, I would say 5 or 10 years, particularly Facebook, I would say, I thought wrongly that this would be a huge shot in the arm to Budgies, and it would allow thousands of people to see these fantastic birds in the comfort of their homes and stimulate them to begin to work with them and take them on as an exhibition endeavor. And the show circuit, which had been the method of advertising for the birds, now went, unfortunately, to Facebook, personal websites, and YouTube. So this, for me, was a very unfortunate side effect of the internet generation. People who could show their birds to thousands of fans here worldwide without ever leaving their couches or, for sure, their homes. So the fancy itself, as I said earlier, is built on the exhibition show circuit. So without that show circuit and award system, our little hobby would die, and I don't think it will die, but because I think there is a way out of this, and that's for all major exhibitors to exhibit every bird that they can. That will start interest back in the shows and exhibition circuits. So the history of the exhibition circuit in America, I think, is very similar to what it is in England. It is in gradual decline. I think that the largest bird show in history of our country that I'm familiar with was in 1956. It was at the Second World Budgies Congress in Chesterfield, Indiana, and the reported entry was 1,200, but there were 1,500 benched, and there were so many birds you couldn't even. Cages were piled 3 and 4 high, uh, and and you couldn't even walk down the aisles. There were so many birds, but it was a incredible show. When you have that number of birds, there's a lot of excitement because you don't know what's going around the next bend. Certainly in the 1970s and 80s, many regional shows in our country were in excess of 500 birds, and the district shows more often at night had 6, 7, 800 birds. So unfortunately, as you know, those days are over. So uh, my final point is decades-long weakening of the exhibitions and the attendance of both people and birds and the fancy. This has got to be reversed. I don't think it's at all impossible, but it is going to take some effort on and leadership, I think, from major exhibitors to bench their birds um, as often as as many birds as they can, as often as they can. So there's nothing to be, and there's nothing, because your bird isn't best in show or on a CC doesn't mean your bird is any worse than any other, worse than it was before the judge didn't select it. So I'm going to spend some time discussing judging budgies in a minute or two in the next video. But I'm just saying to you, I think we're at a critical point in the fancy. I hate to say worldwide because we might be okay in Australia, New Zealand, and in other parts of the world, and I think in the sort of the um, Near East and Far East and Pakistan, India. I think those birds, those shows are being really. I hope that they're really gaining prominence and they're able to show a lot of birds. So I think that may be a model for which us in the West can take some heart. So thank you very much for staying with this, and that's all I have.